The morning light had barely touched the Chicago skyline when Julian Mercer received the envelope. It was sitting on his desk when he arrived at the office. No return address, just his name in careful handwriting on cream-colored paper that smelled faintly of something floral. His assistant, Catherine, said a courier had dropped it off before 7. Julian set down his coffee, loosened his collar one button, the habit of 20 years, and opened it. Inside was a wedding invitation. Preston Cahill and Simone Arquette request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration, Friday evening, the Langham Hotel, Chicago. He read it twice. Then he set it face down on the desk and looked out the window for a long moment at the lake glittering below. Preston Cahill, his former business partner. The man who had shaken his hand across a conference table 7 years ago and promised to build something remarkable with him. And then, when their startup was bleeding capital and the board was circling, had quietly taken a meeting without Julian, come back with a deal that saved himself and dissolved Julian's stake. Down to nothing. It had been done legally, carefully, with the specific kind of precision that only someone who had studied your blind spots could manage. Julian had rebuilt. Of course he had. He was now the founding CEO of Mercer Capital Group, and he had made back everything Preston had taken plus a great deal more. But there are some betrayals that don't live in the bank account. They live somewhere quieter. He flipped the invitation over. P.S. Hope you'll come, Jules, no hard feelings. He almost smiled at that. No hard feelings, as if 7 years of silence required a postscript. He would not go, obviously. And then his phone rang, and it was his younger sister, Priya, who had somehow already heard about the invitation through the social circuit they both occupied, and who said, in the tone she used when she had already decided something, "You have to go. You have to walk in there and look completely fine. Otherwise he wins twice." Julian told her he didn't need to prove anything to Preston Cahill. She told him that wasn't really the point, was it? He went. The Langham was exactly the kind of venue Preston would choose. Grand without being gaudy. The kind of old money aesthetic that new money works very hard to approximate. Chandeliers like frozen waterfalls. Staff who moved like they'd been trained by the military. The lobby smelled of white roses and expensive restraint. Julian arrived early, which he immediately regretted. He stood near the entrance to the main reception hall, holding a glass of champagne he didn't intend to drink, watching the room fill with people he recognized and several he didn't. All of them moving through the space with the ease of those who believed they deserved to be wherever they were. He was deciding whether to find the bar or simply leave when he heard a sound from the corridor to his left. Something between a sharp exhale and a whispered curse, and turned. A woman stood near the wall, partially obscured by a large floral arrangement. She was in a deep burgundy dress that was formal enough for the evening but not quite right for a wedding. Something about the cut suggested she'd dressed for a different kind of night and then course-corrected at the last minute. Her dark hair was pinned up in a way that was elegant but precarious, 1 or 2 pins from coming undone entirely. She was staring at something across the lobby. Julian followed her gaze. Preston Cahill, already holding court near the entrance to the ballroom, laughing at something someone had said, his hand resting casually on the shoulder of a woman in ivory who could only be Simone Arquette. Julian looked back at the woman by the floral arrangement. Her jaw was set. Her hands were clasped in front of her so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. He knew that look. He had worn it himself, once, sitting outside a conference room where a deal was being closed without him. She turned slightly, and for a half-second their eyes met. Hers were dark, quick, intelligent, and then they looked away immediately, the way a person does when they've been caught at something private. Julian turned back to the room. He took a sip of the champagne after all. 30 seconds later he heard footsteps beside him, and then a voice very low, very controlled, as if the words had been rehearsed and then nearly abandoned. "I know this is completely insane," she said, "and I know I have no right to ask this of a total stranger. But is there any chance you would be willing to walk into that room with me, just as if we came together?" He looked at her. She looked back. Her chin was up. She wasn't begging, exactly, but she was close to something honest in a way that most people in this building would never let themselves be. "Why?" he said. She glanced toward Preston. "Because the man hosting this party fired me 14 months ago, told the entire industry I couldn't handle pressure, and apparently invited me tonight because he enjoys theater. And I would very much like to walk in there looking like someone who did not spend the last year eating cereal for dinner." Julian studied her for a moment, the honesty of it, the precise unadorned humiliation of cereal for dinner. He offered her his arm. She blinked. "That's it? You're not going to ask more questions?" "I will," he said. "Should we go?" She took his arm. They walked into the ballroom together. Her name was Nadia Voss. She told him this in a murmur as they crossed the threshold, the way soldiers exchange names before walking into something uncertain. She had been the creative director at Cahill & Associates for 4 years, before Preston had restructured the company and eliminated her position with a speed that suggested it had been planned long before she'd been told. Julian did not say that this was familiar to him. He simply listened. The ballroom was everything the lobby had promised. Nadia walked beside him with her head level and her hand steady on his arm, and he was quietly impressed by the composure she was manufacturing in real time. He could feel the slight tension in her fingers. He could see the careful blankness she'd arranged over her face like a drop cloth. He understood that too. Preston saw them approximately 4 minutes in. Julian watched the exact moment, the slight narrowing of the eyes, the recalibration of expression, the smile that arrived just a fraction of a second too late to look genuine. "Julian Mercer," Preston said, approaching them with his arms slightly open, the gesture of a man who has decided to reframe history. "You actually came." Preston. Julian didn't extend his hand. He'd learned that much from the invitation's postscript. Preston's gaze moved to Nadia and something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of surprise, then calculation, then a quality that Julian found genuinely unpleasant. "Nadia," Preston said smoothly, "I wasn't sure you'd make it." "I wasn't either," she said. Her voice was even. Julian noted it. Simone had drifted over, ivory dress, perfect posture, the specific warmth of a woman who had married into a social position and was managing it beautifully. "We were just saying how good it is that everyone can be here," Simone said, and the everyone had a careful weight to it. "She's not alone," Julian said. He said it simply, without theater. Just a fact being established. Preston's smile recalibrated again. "Of course, and how do you two know each other?" Nadia's fingers pressed slightly against his arm, barely perceptible. Julian had not planned what he said next. He was not a man who acted without planning. He had built an entire company on the principle of precise, considered action. And yet, "We've known each other for a while," he said. "We keep finding our way back to each other." It was not a lie, exactly. It was simply a sentence that permitted misunderstanding. Nadia went still beside him. He did not look at her. Preston looked between them once, twice, then one of his guests appeared at his elbow, requiring his attention, and the moment dissolved. Simone offered a polished goodbye and floated away. Nadia waited until they were clear of the immediate radius, and then she said very quietly, "That was more than I asked for." "I know," Julian said. "Why?" He thought about it. He thought about the postscript on the invitation. "No hard feelings, Jules." He thought about a conference room 7 years ago and a handshake that had meant something different to each man who made it. "Because he does this to people," Julian said, "and someone should be inconvenient about it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "My name is Nadia Voss." She said it as if she was reintroducing herself, as if the first time in the corridor hadn't quite counted. "I used to be pretty good at my job." "Julian Mercer," he said. "I used to know Preston Cahill." And something in her expression shifted, a small surprised acknowledgement of the symmetry. "I know who you are," she said. "Then we're not entirely strangers," he said. She almost smiled. "No, I suppose we're not." They stayed longer than either of them had intended. Julian was not sure when the evening changed from performance to something else, somewhere between the third glass of water he brought her without being asked and the moment she told him, about the months after she was let go, her voice matter of fact, in the way of someone who has stopped flinching at the memory. She had freelanced for a while. She had taken on brand work for clients she didn't believe in, which she described as artistically depressing, said with a precision that made him almost laugh. She had pitched 3 agencies and gotten 2 polite rejections and 1 that was not polite. She had found, eventually, a small creative consultancy that valued her, but it was nothing like what she'd had. It was starting over in your late 30s, she said, which is the same as starting over at any age except your knees hurt. He told her about Preston. Not everything. He had never told anyone everything, but enough. The vote. The deal. The way Preston had called him afterward. Once, to explain that it had been purely a business decision and that Julian would understand eventually. Julian said he had thanked him and hung up and then sat in his car for 45 minutes. Nadia said, I did that too, parking garage actually. He looked at her. Parking garage. Better acoustics for crying, she said, if that's something you want to do. He didn't ask if she had cried. He already knew she had. At some point, Preston and Simone moved to the front of the room for the first dance, and the music shifted, and the gathered crowd turned to watch the couple glide across the floor with practiced ease. Julian watched Preston's hand at the small of Simone's back, the confident possession of it, and felt nothing except a dull recognition that some people move through the world taking, and some people move through the world building, and the two groups occasionally mistake each other for friends. Nadia was watching too. Her expression had closed slightly. Does it still hurt? Julian asked. What he did to you? She considered this honestly. Not the way it used to, she said. It's more like a scar. You don't feel it unless you press it. And tonight. Tonight I pressed it. She exhaled. I don't know why I even opened the invitation. Because you wanted to see if you'd survived, he said. People do that. She looked at him with something that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, but somewhere between them. Did it work? He added. She looked back at the dance floor. I think so, she said. Verdict still out. He drove her home. She hadn't asked him to. He had simply turned toward the valet and said, I'll drive you, and she had not argued. In the car she was quiet in the way of someone whose adrenaline had finally finished and left them with just themselves. She fell asleep somewhere on Michigan Avenue. He noticed the moment her breathing changed, the slight release, the softening of her hands in her lap, and he let her sleep. He drove slowly. He thought about the evening. He thought about what it meant that the first person he had said more than a dozen words to at that party was someone Preston had also hurt. He thought about the symmetry of that, and whether symmetry meant anything, and decided that it probably didn't, but felt significant anyway. And then, almost involuntarily, his mind went backward, the way it sometimes did when he was alone and quiet, and the city was dark. He had been 12 years old. The state group home on the south side, the one with the peeling paint and the radiator that clanged in the winter, and the social worker who came every 2 weeks and always seemed slightly surprised to find him still there. It was not the worst situation he had known, but it was also not a place that taught you to expect much. She had arrived on a Wednesday in November. A young woman, 20-something maybe, with paint under her fingernails, and a messenger bag full of art supplies that she spread across the community room table like she was setting up a market stall. My name is Nadia, she'd said. I'm not a teacher. I'm just someone who makes things, and I thought maybe some of you would want to try it too. Most of the kids had been skeptical. Julian had been skeptical. He sat in the back and watched her explain how to sketch a line that felt like it meant something rather than just a mark on paper, and he'd thought, she's going to last 2 visits, max. She lasted 6 months. Every Wednesday. With her paint-stained hands and her too bright enthusiasm that should have felt performative but somehow didn't. She brought better supplies over time. She learned their names, not just the easy ones. She learned his. She noticed that he drew buildings, always buildings, towers and structures, and the bones of things, and she told him once that architecture was engineering with a soul, and that anyone who could see the way he could see the world had something worth building with. No adult had said anything like that to him before, or after for a while. On her last visit, she'd been accepted to a graduate program out of state, she told them, and she was genuinely sorry to be leaving. She had walked around the room and given each of them something. When she got to Julian, she pressed a small sketchbook into his hands. Hardcover, good paper, the kind that didn't bleed through. Keep drawing the buildings, she'd said. The world needs people who can see the bones of things. He had carried that sketchbook through 3 more group homes, and the apartment he rented at 19, and the first office he couldn't afford at 24. It was in his desk at Capitol now, in the bottom drawer, mostly full. He had never thrown it away. He had thought about her sometimes over the years, the way you think about the things that excite moment and were gone before you could thank them properly. He had not, in 20-plus years, expected to find her at Preston Cahill's wedding reception. He parked outside the address she'd given him, a building in Lincoln Park, solid, well-kept. He looked at her for a moment. The parking garage comment, the cereal for dinner, the chin that stayed up through the whole evening even when her hands had been white at the knuckles. He did not wake her. He sat with the city quiet around him and thought, she doesn't know. She had no idea that the boy she'd handed a sketchbook to on a Wednesday in November was currently parked outside her apartment. He thought about how to say that, whether to say that, what it would mean if he did. She stirred, opened her eyes. For a moment she looked genuinely lost, and then she found her bearings and sat up. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I can't believe I—" "You needed rest," he said. "It's fine." She looked out the window at her building. "This is exactly where I live. You told me the address." "Right," she looked at him. "Thank you, for tonight, for all of it. You would have walked in on your own eventually." "Maybe." She reached for the door handle, then stopped. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why did you help me?" "Really?" She turned to look at him. "You don't know me. You had no reason to." Julian thought about the sketchbook, about the architecture comment, about the world needs people who can see the bones of things. "I had a reason," he said. "I'll explain it someday." She studied him for a moment with those quick, dark eyes. Then she nodded once, decided something, and got out of the car. 3 weeks later, his phone rang with an unknown number, and when he answered, she said, "This is Nadia Voss. I got your information from Catherine. I hope that's all right." "It's fine," he said. He was in a meeting. He stepped out. "I wanted to say thank you properly," she said. "In person, if that's something you'd be open to." They had coffee, then dinner, then a Sunday afternoon at the Art Institute, where she walked him through 3 rooms of architectural drawings and talked about negative space in a way that he found himself thinking about afterward, driving home. For no reason he could immediately explain. She was working on something new, a project for a community arts center on the West Side, pro bono, because the organization couldn't afford what she would normally charge, and she had decided she didn't care. She showed him the preliminary sketches on her phone over dinner one night, and he looked at them for a long moment. "These are good," he said. "I know," she said without embarrassment. "I just need a space to build the program. The building they have is too small." He said he might know someone. She looked at him. "Julian." "I'm not offering money," he said, which was not entirely true. "I'm offering a conversation with someone who owes me a favor." She said she didn't want to be anyone's charity case. He said, "You're not. You're someone with a vision and a resource gap. That's called a business problem, not a charity case. Don't confuse the two." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Catherine mentioned you have a sketchbook in your desk that you've had since you were a kid." He went still. "Catherine talks too much." "She also mentioned that you design the firm's buildings in pencil first, freehand, that you insist on it." "It's a process," he said. "It's unusual," she said, "for someone at your level." He looked at his water glass. "I had a teacher," he said carefully. "When I was young, she told me once that architecture was engineering with a soul, that the people who could see the bones of things had something worth building with." He paused. "It stuck." Nadia went very still across the table. He watched her. He watched her try to place the words, the way the memory moved across her face like a light switching on in a far room, slow, then sudden. "I said that," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Wednesday afternoons," he said. "South Side. You had paint under your fingernails the first time you came in, and you spread your art supplies across the table, like you were setting up a market stall." She stared at him. "You gave me a sketchbook on your last day," he said. "Hardcover, good paper." Her hand came up to cover her mouth. "It's in my desk," he said, "bottom drawer, mostly full." The silence lasted several seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, lower, rougher at the edges. "You were one of my kids," she said. "I was," he said, "for 6 months on Wednesdays." "You were the one who drew buildings." She said it like she was pulling it from somewhere deep, a thing she hadn't known she remembered. "You sat in the back. You never talked much." "No." "But you listened." "Yes." She was blinking rapidly in a way that she was clearly trying to control. "Julian, I didn't know it was you," he said. "That night at the Langham, I just saw someone who looked like she needed to not walk in alone. I didn't figure it out until later, in the car, when I was asleep." "Yes." She let out a sound that was almost a laugh. "You drove me home and didn't say anything." "I didn't know how." She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the restaurant noise seemed to dim around them, the specific kind of quiet that happens when two people are on the edge of something, and both of them know it. "I thought about those kids," she said. "Over the years, I always wondered if any of it had meant anything." "It meant everything," he said, "to at least one of them." The tears came then. She didn't fight them exactly, just accepted them, pressing her lips together as they fell. He didn't look away, and he didn't fill the silence with anything unnecessary. When she'd gathered herself, she said, "I still can't believe you're you." "I'm not entirely sure I can either," he said. The Arts Center opened on a Thursday in April under a sky that couldn't decide between overcast and clear and finally settled on both. The building was modest, a converted warehouse in East Garfield Park. High ceilings, good light, the bones of it excellent. Nadia had done the interior design herself, choosing materials that were durable and warm and not especially expensive, which she said was the whole point. Julian stood near the back of the small crowd gathered for the opening. He had provided the space, through a genuine conversation with someone who did genuinely owe him a favor, and had otherwise stayed out of it, because it was hers. The children came in from a school group 3 blocks away, filing in with the particular chaotic energy of kids who have been told to behave, which means they are approximately 30 seconds from not behaving. Nadia met them at the door and knelt down to their level and said something that made 2 of them immediately laugh. Julian watched her. He thought about a community room with peeling walls and a young woman who spread art supplies across a table and said, "I'm not a teacher, I'm just someone who makes things." He thought about how that sentence had been precise, the right to say to a 12-year-old boy who had been failed by most of the systems that were supposed to help him, and who was suspicious of anything that looked like an official attempt. She had not looked official, she had looked like a person. He had spent 20 years trying to figure out how to become someone who could do for others what she had done for him without knowing it. He had given to foundations and funded scholarships and served on nonprofit boards with genuine commitment. But he had always been aware that there was something different about what she had offered. Something that couldn't be replicated by writing a check, which was the presence of a person who showed up, Wednesday after Wednesday, and simply refused to treat a room full of forgotten kids as anything other than worth her time. He had not found a way to replicate that. She had just gone ahead and kept doing it. He thought about a woman standing near a floral arrangement in a hotel lobby, her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles were white. He thought about her voice, "I know this is completely insane," and the honesty of it, the specific bravery of asking a stranger for help when everything in you is trained to seem fine. He thought about the sketchbook in his desk drawer, almost full now, 30 years of buildings in pencil. Nadia looked up from across the room. She found him immediately. She always did. And something passed between them, the shorthand of people who have started to speak a common language. She crossed the room. She was still wearing the faint trace of a smile from whatever she'd said to the children. "How does it look?" she said. He looked around at the space, the light, the table set up for creating, the walls left intentionally bare so students could eventually fill them. "It looks like a place where something will happen," he said. She stood beside him and looked at it too. "That's the whole idea," she said quietly. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the sketchbook. She recognized it immediately. Her eyes went to it before he'd said anything, the worn cover, the particular aged look of something kept for a very long time. He held it out to her. She looked up at him. "Julian." "It's full," he said. "I figured that meant it was done." She took it carefully, both hands, the way you hold something that belongs to more than one person. She turned it over. She ran her thumb along the spine. "What are you going to draw in now?" she said. "I thought I'd start over," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes very clear and very direct. "I have a better idea," she said, and she opened the sketchbook to the last page, still blank, a single clean page he'd left at the end, and she wrote something on it in her own handwriting and handed it back to him. He read it. The bones of things, and the people who see them. Keep building. He looked up. She was already reaching into her bag. She pulled out a fresh sketchbook, hardcover, good paper, the same kind she had given him 30 years ago, and pressed it into his hands. For the next 30 years, she said. He held it for a moment. Then he looked at her, this woman who had appeared in his life twice now when he needed the reminder most. Once when he was 12 and learning that the world might have something for him after all, and once when he was 41 and had nearly forgotten why any of it was worth building. Stay, he said. It was the only word that mattered. She smiled, real unhurried, the kind that starts in the eyes. I was already planning to, she said. Outside, the sky had finally decided. The clouds moved off, and the April light came through the warehouse windows clean and direct, falling across the bare walls that were waiting to be filled, across the tables where children would sit and make things and maybe hear one sentence that would stay with them for 30 years. Nadia Voss took his hand. Julian Mercer held on. I keep thinking about the moment Julian handed that sketchbook back. Not the proposal. Not the grand opening. That one quiet gesture, a worn hardcover, 30 years of buildings in pencil, pressed into the hands of the woman who had first told him his way of seeing the world was worth something. That's the part that stays with me. Because here's what I've come to believe. The things we do when no one is watching us, when there's nothing to gain and no applause coming, those are the things that actually build a life. Nadia walked into a group home on a Wednesday in November with paint under her fingernails and a bag full of art supplies, and she did it again the next Wednesday, and the one after that. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because she had decided those kids were worth her time, and she refused to let the world's indifference talk her out of that decision. That's not sentiment, that's character. That's the kind of moral backbone that quietly shapes everything downstream. And Julian, he sat in the back of that room at 12 years old and heard one sentence that rewired something in him. The world needs people who can see the bones of things. He carried that for 30 years. He built a company on the discipline of that idea. He kept a worn-out sketchbook in his bottom drawer, not as a trophy but as a reminder of who he was before the world had any reason to take him seriously. That kind of intellectual honesty, knowing where you came from, refusing to let success make you forget the people who made it possible, that's rarer than money. A lot rarer. What gets me about Preston is that he probably considered himself equally smart. He was, in certain technical ways. But intelligence without integrity is just a more efficient way to take things from people. He maneuvered. He optimized. He invited both Julian and Nadia to his wedding, like a man who has confused the absence of consequences with the presence of grace. He confused those two his whole life, I think, and that confusion cost him everything that actually matters. The respect of people who knew him well enough to know better. Julian and Nadia both lost something to Preston, and they both rebuilt, not because life rewarded their suffering, but because they each had the kind of determination that doesn't ask permission to keep going. Nadia ate cereal for dinner, and pitched agencies that said no and got up the next morning and kept working. Julian restructured and refocused and built Mercer Capital from the bottom up without bitterness becoming his operating principle. That's not luck. That's the specific discipline of people who have decided that what happens next matters more than what happened to them. They found each other twice, once by accident, once by staying in rooms long enough to let honesty catch up to them. I think about that sometimes, how much of the good in our lives depends on us being willing to stay in the room. To not flee when something gets uncomfortable or ambiguous or uncertain. Julian could have driven away from that hotel lobby. Nadia could have turned around at the door. Instead, they both stayed and kept staying, and slowly the real story between them had room to surface. The sketchbook is full, time to start a new one. That's the only ending worth building toward.